Sarah Mae Thompson stood at the edge of Willow Creek's main street, watching the townspeople hurry past without so much as a glance in her direction. At 28, she had grown accustomed to being invisible, to being the woman everyone whispered about but no one acknowledged. The October wind whipped through her worn brown dress, and she pulled her shawl tighter around her shoulders. "There goes the cursed woman," Mrs. Henderson muttered to her companion as they passed by the general store. "Mark my words, she'll die alone in that cabin of hers. No man would ever want damaged goods like that." Sarah's jaw tightened, but she kept walking. She had heard variations of those words for the past 10 years, ever since the incident that had branded her as unmarriageable in this small Texas town. The scar that ran from her left temple to her jawline served as a constant reminder of that terrible night, but it was the invisible scars that hurt the most. She pushed open the door to Miller's General Store, the bell chiming overhead. The conversation at the counter stopped abruptly as three women turned to stare at her. Sarah kept her head high and walked to the back of the store where the farming supplies were kept. She needed wire for her fence, and, whether these women approved or not, she had work to do. "Can't believe she shows her face in public," whispered Mrs. Caldwell, loud enough for Sarah to hear. "After what happened with the Jameson boy, decent folk shouldn't have to look at her." Sarah's hands trembled slightly as she counted out coins for the wire. The Jameson boy had been 17, wild and reckless, and he had tried to force himself on her one night when she was walking home from her job at the schoolhouse. In defending herself, she had pushed him away, and he had fallen and struck his head on a rock. The boy had lived, but the story that spread through town was quite different from the truth. "I heard she used some kind of witchcraft on him," another voice whispered. "How else could a woman overpower a strong young man like that?" Mr. Miller, the store owner, cleared his throat nervously as Sarah approached the counter. He was one of the few people in town who still treated her with basic courtesy, perhaps because she always paid her bills on time and never caused trouble. "That'll be $2.50, Miss Thompson," he said quietly. Sarah placed the exact change on the counter. "Thank you, Mr. Miller." As she turned to leave, Mrs. Caldwell stepped directly into her path. "You know, some of us have been talking. Maybe it's time you considered moving on from Willow Creek. Find somewhere else where folks don't know your history." Sarah looked the woman straight in the eye. "This is my home, Mrs. Caldwell. I was born here, just like you. I have as much right to be here as anyone." "Rights?" Mrs. Caldwell laughed harshly. "You lost your rights when you chose to live like you do. A decent woman would have left town in shame by now." Sarah felt the familiar burn of humiliation in her chest, but she refused to let these women see her break. She had promised herself long ago that she would never again let anyone make her feel small. "Good day, ladies," she said firmly, stepping around Mrs. Caldwell and walking out of the store with her head held high. The walk back to her cabin took her past the church, where Reverend Walsh was tending to his garden. He looked up as she approached, and, for a moment, Sarah thought he might offer a kind word. Instead, he averted his gaze and hurried inside. Even the man of God couldn't bring himself to acknowledge her existence. Sarah's cabin sat on 20 acres of land that her father had left her when he died 5 years ago. It was good land, with a creek running through it and fertile soil that grew vegetables and wildflowers with equal enthusiasm. She had managed to make a decent living selling eggs, vegetables, and handmade quilts, but the isolation was wearing on her soul. As she approached her front porch, she noticed fresh horse tracks in the mud near her fence. Someone had been on her property, and recently. Sarah frowned, setting down her supplies and following the tracks around the side of her cabin. They led to her chicken coop, where the gate stood slightly ajar. Her heart sank as she counted her chickens. 3 were missing, including her best layer, Henrietta. This wasn't the first time someone had stolen from her, and it wouldn't be the last. In a town where she had no allies, there was little point in reporting the theft to Sheriff Morton. He would just find a way to blame her for tempting thieves. Sarah secured the chicken coop and made her way back to the cabin. The interior was simple but clean, with furniture her father had built with his own hands. She had added feminine touches over the years, lace curtains, quilts and bright colors, and wildflower arrangements that brought life to the small space. She put on a pot of coffee and sat down at her kitchen table to work on her latest quilt. The repetitive motion of stitching had always calmed her mind, and today she needed that peace more than ever. The pattern she was working on was called Wedding Ring, an ironic choice for a woman who had been told repeatedly that no man would ever want her. As the afternoon wore on, Sarah found herself thinking about her past, about the dreams she had once held. Before the incident with the Jameson boy, she had been courted by Thomas Gardner, the banker's son. They had talked of marriage, of children, of building a life together. But, after that night, Thomas had disappeared from her life as if she had been struck by lightning. "You understand, don't you, Sarah," his mother had said when she came to break the engagement. "Thomas has a reputation to maintain. His future depends on marrying a woman of spotless character." Spotless character. Sarah had been 19 years old, working as a schoolteacher, attending church every Sunday, and living a life of complete propriety. But, one night of defending herself against an attack had destroyed all of that in the eyes of her community. The sound of approaching horses broke through her memories. Sarah looked out her window and felt her stomach drop. 3 men were riding up to her cabin, and she recognized them all. Jake Morrison, Pete Hawkins, and Danny Jameson, the brother of the boy whose attack had ruined her reputation. Sarah quickly put away her sewing and checked that her door was securely latched. These men had never caused her physical harm, but they took pleasure in intimidating her, in reminding her of her place in the town's social order. "Sarah May!" Jake Morrison called out, his voice slurred with alcohol. "Come on out here and talk to us." She remained silent, hoping they would get tired and leave. Through the window, she could see them dismounting from their horses, stumbling slightly as they approached her porch. "We know you're in there," Danny Jameson shouted. "My brother told me all about what kind of woman you really are." Sarah's hands clenched into fists. Danny's brother had tried to assault her, but somehow the story had been twisted until she was the villain. She had learned long ago that the truth mattered little when faced with the power of reputation and social standing. "Maybe she's too good to talk to us working men," Pete Hawkins laughed. "Think she's some kind of queen out here in her little castle." The men began to circle her cabin, peering into windows and making crude comments about her appearance and her supposed moral failings. Sarah sat perfectly still at her kitchen table, knowing that any response would only encourage them further. After what felt like hours but was probably only 30 minutes, the men finally grew bored and rode away, leaving behind empty whiskey bottles and the lingering scent of unwashed bodies and alcohol. Sarah waited until she could no longer hear their horses before allowing herself to breathe normally again. This was her life in Willow Creek, endless isolation punctuated by moments of harassment and humiliation. She was 28 years old, and the town had decided that she would die alone, unwanted and unmourned. Sometimes, in her darkest moments, Sarah wondered if they might be right. That evening, as she fed her remaining chickens and secured her property for the night, Sarah made a decision. She would not let this town break her spirit completely. She would continue to hold her head high, continue to work her land, and continue to live her life with dignity, regardless of what others thought or said. But, deep in her heart, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was fighting a losing battle. The loneliness was becoming harder to bear with each passing year, and the wall of hostility surrounding her seemed to grow thicker every day. Perhaps Mrs. Caldwell was right. Perhaps it was time to consider leaving Willow Creek and starting fresh somewhere else, somewhere no one knew her story. As she settled into bed that night, Sarah looked out her window at the vast Texas sky dotted with stars. Somewhere out there was a life she had never lived, filled with people who might see her as more than just a damaged woman with a scarred face and a ruined reputation. But leaving would mean abandoning the only home she had ever known, the land her father had worked so hard to leave her, the memories of happier times before everything went wrong. Sarah pulled her quilt up to her chin and closed her eyes, unaware that her life was about to change in ways she never could have imagined. Tomorrow would bring a stranger to Willow Creek, a man whose arrival would challenge everything the town believed about Sarah Mae Thompson and force them to confront the cruelty of their own judgments. The wind picked up outside her window, carrying with it the promise of change, though Sarah slept on, unaware that her destiny was riding toward her on horseback, guided by forces larger than the small-minded prejudices of a small Texas town. Her story was far from over, despite what the gossips of Willow Creek might believe. The thundering hooves announced his arrival before anyone in Willow Creek could see him coming. Marcus Steele rode into town at dawn on a black stallion, his long coat trailing behind him like a shadow against the morning light. The horse's breath created clouds of steam in the cool air, and both rider and animal moved with the fluid grace of beings accustomed to covering vast distances across unforgiving terrain. Marcus brought his horse to a halt outside the Silver Dollar Saloon, dust settling around them as he dismounted with practiced ease. He was a tall man, well over 6 feet, with broad shoulders that spoke of years spent working cattle and taming wild horses. His dark hair fell to his collar, and a week's growth of beard covered his strong jaw. But it was his eyes that would be remembered by those who met him, pale blue, like winter ice, and utterly fearless. Sheriff Morton happened to be walking past when the stranger arrived, and something about the man's bearing made him stop and take notice. This wasn't some drifter looking for work or a traveling salesman peddling goods. This was a man who commanded attention without saying a word, someone whose very presence changed the atmosphere of whatever space he occupied. "Morning," Marcus said, tipping his hat slightly to the sheriff. His voice was deep, with a slight drawl that suggested origins somewhere further south. "Morning," Sheriff Morton replied, eyeing the well-maintained Colt .45 that hung low on the stranger's hip. "You planning on staying in town long?" Marcus smiled, but it didn't reach those ice-blue eyes. "That depends on what I find here, Sheriff. I'm looking for someone." Before the sheriff could ask more questions, Marcus had tied his horse to the hitching post and pushed through the saloon doors. Even at this early hour, the Silver Dollar had several customers nursing coffee and whiskey, trying to chase away the chill of the October morning. The conversation stopped when Marcus entered. Heads turned, and several men shifted uncomfortably in their chairs. There was something about this stranger that set everyone on edge, not fear, exactly, but a recognition that this was not a man to be trifled with. "What can I get you?" asked Jimmy Brennan, the bartender, wiping down a glass with more attention than it required. "Coffee, black," Marcus replied, settling onto a bar stool with the easy confidence of a man comfortable in any environment. "And information." Jimmy poured the coffee and slid it across the bar. "What kind of information?" "I'm looking for a woman named Sarah Mae Thompson. I understand she lives somewhere around here." The silence that followed was so complete that the sound of a fly buzzing near the window seemed loud. Every man in the saloon was staring at Marcus now, their faces showing a mixture of surprise, curiosity, and something that might have been concern. Jake Morrison, who had been among the men harassing Sarah the previous evening, spoke up from his table near the window. "What would a man like you want with Sarah Mae Thompson?" Marcus turned slowly on his barstool, fixing Jake with that icy stare. "That would be between me and Miss Thompson." "Miss Thompson?" Jake laughed, but there was nervousness in the sound. "Mister, I don't know where you come from, but around here, we don't use titles of respect for that woman." Marcus stood up from his barstool, and several men instinctively moved their hands closer to their weapons. He didn't appear threatening, but there was coiled power in his movements, like a wolf rising to its full height. "Is that so?" Marcus asked quietly. "And why is that?" Pete Hawkins, emboldened by Jake's words and the whiskey he had been drinking since sunrise, decided to enlighten the stranger. "Because she's trouble, friend. Scarred up and mean as a rattlesnake. Attacked a young man from one of our best families, nearly killed him. No decent man would have anything to do with her." Marcus listened to this explanation with the patience of a man accustomed to hearing lies. When Pete finished speaking, the stranger nodded thoughtfully and took a sip of his coffee. "I see," Marcus said finally. "And this young man she supposedly attacked, what was his name?" "Billy Jameson," Jake supplied. "Good kid from a good family. She lured him out behind the schoolhouse one night and went after him with a rock." Marcus nodded again, as if filing this information away for future reference. "And where might I find the Jameson family?" The men exchanged glances. There was something in the stranger's tone that made them uneasy, though they couldn't quite put their finger on what it was. "They live on the big ranch east of town," Jimmy the bartender said. But, if you're thinking of courting Sarah Mae Thompson, you might want to reconsider. Like Pete said, she's trouble. Marcus finished his coffee and placed 2 coins on the bar. Gentlemen, I appreciate your perspective. Now, if someone could direct me to Miss Thompson's property? Sheriff Morton, who had followed the stranger into the saloon, stepped forward. Mind if I ask what business you have with her? Marcus turned those pale blue eyes on the sheriff, and, for a moment, Sheriff Morton felt like a rabbit caught in the gaze of a hunting hawk. Personal business, Sheriff. Nothing that concerns the law. Everything that happens in my town concerns the law, Sheriff Morton replied, trying to project authority despite the fact that this stranger made him profoundly nervous. Marcus smiled that cold smile again. Of course, Sheriff. I'm sure Miss Thompson will appreciate your protective interest in her welfare. The sarcasm in his voice was subtle but unmistakable. Sheriff Morton felt his face flush, knowing that everyone in the saloon had heard the implication that he had not, in fact, been particularly protective of Sarah Mae Thompson. Her place is about 3 miles north of town, the sheriff said stiffly. Follow the creek road until you see a cabin with a blue door. You can't miss it. Marcus tipped his hat. Much obliged, Sheriff. Gentlemen. He walked out of the saloon with the same quiet confidence he had entered with, leaving behind a room full of men who suddenly had a great deal to discuss. Through the window, they watched him mount his black stallion and ride north out of town, his coat billowing behind him like dark wings. What do you suppose that was about? Pete asked, breaking the silence. Nothing good, Jake replied. Mark my words, that man means trouble. But, even as they speculated about the stranger's intentions, none of them could shake the feeling that they had just encountered something beyond their experience or understanding. Marcus Steele was not like the other men who had occasionally passed through Willow Creek. He was something else entirely. As Marcus rode toward Sarah's cabin, he reflected on what he had learned in town. The story the men had told him was exactly what he had expected to hear, a twisted version of events that painted Sarah as the aggressor and her attacker as the victim. He had heard similar stories in other towns, about other women who had dared to defend themselves against unwanted advances. The truth was always more complicated than the version preferred by those in power, and Marcus had learned long ago to look beneath the surface of any story involving a woman's reputation. In his experience, a woman who was universally condemned by a community was often guilty of nothing more than refusing to be victimized. The creek road was easy to follow, winding through stands of oak and pine that were just beginning to show their autumn colors. Marcus's horse moved at an easy pace, covering the distance between town and Sarah's property with the smooth gait of an animal bred for endurance rather than speed. When Sarah's cabin came into view, Marcus brought his horse to a stop and studied the property with a practiced eye. The cabin was small but well-maintained, with a garden that showed signs of careful tending despite the late season. The chicken coop was sturdy, the fences in good repair, and everything about the place spoke of someone who took pride in their home. As he approached the cabin, Marcus could see a woman working in the garden behind the house. She was bent over a row of late vegetables, her movements efficient and purposeful. When she heard the sound of approaching hooves, she straightened up and turned toward him, one hand shading her eyes against the morning sun. Sarah's first thought when she saw the stranger was to run. Living alone had taught her to be cautious around unfamiliar men, especially ones who looked as dangerous as this one did. But something about his posture as he sat his horse, respectful, non-threatening despite his obvious strength, made her stand her ground. Marcus dismounted slowly, keeping his hands visible and his movements deliberate. He had learned that approaching a woman who lived alone required delicacy, especially a woman who had clearly experienced trouble with men before. Miss Thompson, he called out, maintaining a respectful distance. My name is Marcus Steele. I was wondering if I might have a word with you. Sarah's hand moved instinctively to the scar on her face, a gesture she wasn't even aware of anymore. The stranger's voice was courteous, but she had learned not to trust appearances when it came to men. What do you want? She asked, proud of the fact that her voice remained steady. Marcus removed his hat, revealing hair that was dark as midnight and eyes that seemed to see everything. I have some information about your brother, Miss Thompson. Information I believe you'll want to hear. Sarah felt the world tilt slightly. She hadn't heard from her brother David in over 2 years, not since he had left Willow Creek to seek his fortune in California. His last letter had mentioned finding work with a cattle operation somewhere in the mountains, but, since then, there had been silence. "My brother," she repeated, taking an unconscious step forward. Is he all right?" Marcus nodded, noting the genuine concern in her voice. "He's alive, Miss Thompson. More than alive, actually. He's doing quite well for himself. But, perhaps we could continue this conversation somewhere more comfortable? I have a lot to tell you, and I suspect you'll want to sit down for some of it." Sarah looked toward her cabin, then, back at this stranger who claimed to have news of David. Every instinct told her to be careful, to keep her distance from this man who radiated danger like heat from a fire. But, the possibility of news about her brother overrode her caution. "You can water your horse at the trough," she said finally. "I'll put on some coffee." As Marcus led his stallion to the water trough, he noticed several things about Sarah's property that the men in town hadn't mentioned. The vegetable garden was large and well-planned, suggesting someone with considerable farming knowledge. The chicken coop, while missing several birds, was built with professional skill. Most telling of all, the entire property had an air of prosperity and self-sufficiency that contradicted the image of a desperate, unstable woman. Sarah watched the stranger from her kitchen window as she prepared coffee. He moved with the easy confidence of someone completely comfortable around horses, and his stallion responded to him with the trust that came from years of partnership. Whatever else this Marcus Steele might be, he was clearly a man who understood animals. When she opened the cabin door to invite him inside, Sarah was struck by how large he seemed in her small doorway. But, he removed his hat again and waited for her invitation before entering, showing the kind of courtesy that had become rare in her experience with men. "Please, sit down," Sarah said, gesturing toward the table where she had placed 2 cups of coffee. "Now, tell me about David." Marcus settled into the chair across from her, noting the simple but clean interior of the cabin, the carefully mended furniture, and the beautiful quilt that covered the back of her sofa. Everything about the place spoke of a woman who took pride in her surroundings despite having little money to work with. "Your brother is foreman of one of the largest cattle operations in California," Marcus began. "He's built quite a reputation for himself as a man who can handle difficult situations and get things done. He's also accumulated considerable wealth." Sarah's eyes widened. David had always been ambitious, but she had never imagined he would rise so far so quickly. "How do you know all this?" Marcus smiled, and, for the first time, Sarah saw warmth in those pale blue eyes. "Because I own that cattle operation, Miss Thompson. Your brother has been working for me for the past 18 months, and he's become far more than just an employee. He's become a friend." The implications of this statement hit Sarah like a physical blow. If this man owned a large cattle operation and considered David a friend, then he was wealthy and powerful, the kind of man who would never normally associate with someone like her. "I don't understand," Sarah said slowly. "If you know David, then you know about me. About what people say about me. Why are you here?" Marcus leaned back in his chair, studying her face with those intense blue eyes. "I'm here, Miss Thompson, because your brother talks about you constantly. He blames himself for leaving you alone here, for not taking you with him when he left Willow Creek. He spent the last year trying to save enough money to come back and get you." Sarah felt tears prick at her eyes. "He wants me to come to California?" "More than that," Marcus replied. "He's asked me to come get you. To bring you back with me so that you can start a new life somewhere people don't know your past." The offer hung in the air between them like a bridge spanning a vast chasm. Sarah stared at this stranger who claimed to be offering her everything she had dreamed of: escape, a new beginning, freedom from the crushing weight of Willow Creek's judgment. "Why would you do this for someone you've never met?" she asked finally. Marcus was quiet for a long moment, and, when he spoke, his voice carried a weight of emotion that hadn't been there before. "Because I know what it's like to be judged for things beyond your control, Miss Thompson. I know what it's like to have a community decide who you are based on lies and assumptions. And I know that sometimes, the only way to find peace is to leave everything behind and start over." Sarah looked into those pale blue eyes and saw something she hadn't expected: understanding. This man, whoever he was, knew exactly what her life had been like in Willow Creek. He understood the isolation, the whispers, the constant weight of other people's disapproval. "When would we leave?" she asked quietly. Marcus smiled, and this time it reached his eyes. "Whenever you're ready, Miss Thompson. Your brother is waiting." Outside, the wind was picking up, rattling the windows of the small cabin. But, inside, Sarah Mae Thompson was feeling something she hadn't experienced in 10 long years: hope. The future, which had seemed so bleak just hours before, was suddenly full of possibilities she had never dared to imagine. The stranger from California had brought more than just news of her brother. He had brought the promise of redemption, of a life where she could be more than just the scarred woman everyone expected to die alone and forgotten. Sarah Mae Thompson was about to discover that sometimes salvation came riding into your life on a black stallion, wearing a long coat and speaking with the quiet authority of someone who had the power to change everything. News of the stranger's visit to Sarah Mae Thompson spread through Willow Creek like wildfire. By noon, half the town knew that the mysterious man with the pale blue eyes had spent the morning at her cabin, and speculation ran wild about what this might mean. Mrs. Henderson was the first to voice what many were thinking as she stood in the middle of the general store, holding court with a group of other women. "Mark my words, that woman has bewitched him somehow. No decent man would willingly associate with her unless she had used some kind of unnatural influence." "Maybe she's finally found someone as twisted as she is," suggested Mrs. Caldwell, her voice dripping with malicious satisfaction. Birds of a feather, after all. But not everyone in town was convinced that Sarah's visitor was bad news. Dr. William Hayes, one of the few people in Willow Creek who had maintained a neutral stance regarding Sarah over the years, had observed the stranger carefully when he rode through town, and what he saw troubled him. "That's no ordinary drifter," he told his wife Eleanor over dinner. "That man has money, education, and breeding. You can see it in the way he carries himself, the quality of his clothes and equipment. Whatever brought him to Sarah Thompson, it wasn't desperation or mutual depravity." Eleanor Hayes was one of the few women in town who had never joined in the gossip about Sarah, partly because her husband had forbidden it and partly because she had always harbored private doubts about the official version of what had happened with Billy Jameson. "Perhaps," she said carefully, "someone outside our little community might see Sarah differently than we do." Dr. Hayes nodded thoughtfully. "That's exactly what I'm afraid of, my dear. If this stranger has money and influence, and if he takes Sarah's side of the story back to wherever he came from, it could reflect very poorly on Willow Creek." Meanwhile, at the Jameson Ranch, Billy's father Samuel was having a heated discussion with his son about the stranger's arrival. Billy, now 27 but still living under his father's roof and authority, shifted uncomfortably in his chair as his father paced back and forth across the ranch house's main room. "You're sure you told me everything that happened that night?" Samuel Jameson demanded for the 100th time. "Because if this stranger starts asking questions, I need to know exactly what we're dealing with." Billy's hands trembled slightly as he reached for his whiskey glass. The truth was that he remembered very little about that night, having been extremely drunk and filled with youthful arrogance. What he did remember was humiliating. Sarah Thompson had rejected his advances and then defended herself when he became aggressive. The fall that had injured him had been entirely his own fault, the result of his stumbling backward in anger and striking his head on a rock. But admitting the truth would destroy his family's reputation and his own standing in the community. It was easier to maintain the lie that had been built around that night, the story that cast him as the innocent victim of an unstable woman's unprovoked attack. "I told you what happened," Billy said sullenly. "She went crazy and attacked me for no reason." Samuel stopped pacing and fixed his son with a hard stare. "Then, we have nothing to worry about. The truth is on our side." But, even as he said the words, Samuel felt a cold knot of worry in his stomach. He had built his family's reputation on the assumption that no one would ever seriously question their version of events. The arrival of a wealthy, powerful stranger who seemed interested in Sarah Thompson changed that equation significantly. Back in town, Sheriff Morton was dealing with his own concerns about the situation. Several prominent citizens had already approached him, demanding to know what he intended to do about the stranger's presence in their community. "You can't just let him waltz in here and disrupt our peaceful town," insisted Banker Matthews, mopping sweat from his forehead despite the cool weather. "God only knows what lies that woman is filling his head with. As far as I know, he hasn't broken any laws," Sheriff Morton replied carefully. "I can't arrest a man for visiting someone." "Then, find a reason to run him out of town," suggested Jake Morrison, who had been drinking heavily since his encounter with the stranger that morning. "Men like that are nothing but trouble." Sheriff Morton was beginning to realize that the arrival of Marcus Steele had exposed something ugly about Willow Creek that he had been content to ignore for years. The town's treatment of Sarah Thompson had always made him uncomfortable, but he had gone along with it because it was easier than standing up to popular opinion. Now, faced with the possibility that their actions might be judged by someone from outside their insular community, many of the town's leaders were revealing the full extent of their fear and hatred. It was not a pretty sight. As the afternoon wore on, the pressure on Sheriff Morton increased. A delegation of the town's most prominent citizens gathered in his office, demanding action. "That woman has been a blight on this community for 10 years, declared Reverend Walsh, his usually gentle demeanor replaced by cold determination. "We've tolerated her presence out of Christian charity, but we cannot allow her to bring more trouble down on our heads." "What exactly are you suggesting, Reverend?" Sheriff Morton asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. "She needs to leave Willow Creek," the Reverend replied firmly. "Tonight, before this situation gets any worse. And if she won't go willingly, then measures must be taken to ensure that she does." Sheriff Morton felt a chill run down his spine. "Reverend, you're talking about running someone out of town who hasn't committed any crime. Sarah Thompson owns her property legally. She has every right to be here." "Rights?" Banker Matthews laughed harshly. "What about the rights of decent people to live in peace without having to look at that scarred reminder of violence and depravity every day?" The sheriff looked around the room at these men he had known for years, men he had considered pillars of the community, and realized that he was seeing their true faces for perhaps the first time. The mask of civilization had slipped, revealing the ugly prejudice and fear that lay beneath. "I won't be party to vigilante justice," he said firmly. "If you have a legal complaint against Miss Thompson, file it through proper channels. Otherwise, leave her alone." The men exchanged dark glances, and Sheriff Morton realized that his refusal to cooperate had just made him an enemy of some very powerful people. But he had taken an oath to uphold the law, not to enforce the prejudices of the town's elite. As evening approached, Sarah was preparing for what might be her last night in the only home she had ever known. Marcus had given her time to consider his offer, promising to return in the morning for her answer, but, in her heart, she already knew what her decision would be. She moved through her cabin, touching familiar objects and remembering the life she had built here despite everything. The quilt her grandmother had taught her to make, the rocking chair her father had carved with his own hands, the books that had been her companions during the loneliest years of her life. As she packed her few precious possessions into a traveling bag, Sarah allowed herself to imagine what life might be like in California. She pictured herself in a place where no one knew her story, where she could walk down a street without enduring stares and whispers. For the first time in years, she dared to dream of a future that included friendship, respect, and perhaps even love. The sound of approaching horses broke through her reverie, and Sarah's heart sank as she looked out her window. A group of riders was approaching her cabin, their faces grim in the fading light. She recognized several of them: Jake Morrison, Pete Hawkins, Danny Jameson, and others who had never made any secret of their hostility toward her. Sarah quickly extinguished her lamps and moved away from the windows, hoping they would think she wasn't home. But the men dismounted and began to surround her cabin, making it clear that they weren't planning to leave anytime soon. "Sarah Mae Thompson," Jake Morrison called out, his voice slurred with alcohol and ugly with menace. "We know you're in there. Come out and face us like the woman you claim to be." Sarah's hands shook as she checked the locks on her doors and windows. She had faced harassment before, but there was something different about tonight, something more dangerous in the men's voices. "We've been talking, Sarah Mae," Pete Hawkins shouted. "We've decided it's time for you to move on from Willow Creek. Tonight." You've brought enough shame on this town, Danny Jameson added, his voice thick with years of accumulated resentment. It's time to pay the price for what you did to my brother. Sarah crept to her bedroom window and peered out through a crack in the curtains. She could see at least 6 men, and there might be more in the shadows. They were armed, and, from the way they were moving, it was clear they had been drinking heavily. We're giving you one chance to leave peacefully, Jake Morrison continued. Pack your things and get out of town tonight, or we'll make sure you leave the hard way. Sarah's mind raced as she tried to think of her options. She could try to slip out the back door and make her way to town, but they would probably catch her before she got very far. She could try to fight, but she was one woman against half a dozen armed men. As if reading her thoughts, Pete Hawkins called out, "Don't bother trying to run, Sarah May. We've got men posted all around your property. The only way you're leaving here tonight is in a wagon headed out of town." Sarah closed her eyes and tried to control her fear. After 10 years of enduring their hatred and contempt, the people of Willow Creek had finally decided to take direct action against her. The arrival of Marcus Steele had apparently been the final straw, the thing that pushed them from passive hostility to active violence. Your new friend ain't here to protect you now, Danny Jameson taunted. Just you and us, the way it should have been years ago. Sarah moved away from the window and sat down on her bed, trying to think clearly despite her terror. She had always known this day might come, had always known that the town's tolerance for her presence was limited and conditional. But, somehow, she had hoped that her quiet, law-abiding life would be enough to protect her from their worst impulses. Outside, the men were growing impatient. Sarah could hear them moving around her cabin, testing doors and windows, looking for a way inside. The sound of breaking glass from her kitchen window made her jump, and she realized that her time was running out. Last chance, Sarah May. Jake Morrison shouted. Come out now, or we're coming in to get you. Sarah stood up and moved toward her bedroom door, knowing that she had to make a choice. She could surrender and hope that they would be satisfied with simply running her out of town, or she could continue to hide and risk facing their anger when they inevitably broke down her doors. As she reached for the door handle, the sound of approaching hoofbeats made everyone freeze. Through the sudden silence, Sarah could hear a single horse approaching at a gallop, its rider pushing the animal hard through the darkness. The men outside began to mutter among themselves, clearly surprised by this unexpected development. Sarah crept back to her window and peered out, trying to see who was coming. Through the darkness, she could make out a single rider on a black horse, approaching her cabin with the same quiet confidence she had witnessed that morning. Marcus Steele had returned, and, from the way he sat his horse as he surveyed the scene before him, it was clear that he was not surprised to find trouble waiting. Well, Jake Morrison called out, trying to maintain his bravado despite the obvious change in the situation. Look who's come to play hero. Marcus brought his stallion to a halt about 50 feet from the cabin, positioning himself where he could see all of the men clearly. When he spoke, his voice carried across the night air with the calm authority of someone completely in control of the situation. Gentlemen, he said quietly, I believe you're trespassing on private property. The confrontation that Sarah had been dreading was about to begin, but now she would not face it alone. Marcus Steele had returned, and the pale-eyed stranger who had promised to change her life was about to prove that some promises were worth fighting for. The night air crackled with tension as two very different visions of justice prepared to clash under the starlit Texas sky. Sarah Mae Thompson's fate hung in the balance, but, for the first time in 10 years, she had a champion willing to stand between her and the hatred that had defined her existence. The reckoning that had been building for a decade was finally at hand. Marcus Steele dismounted from his black stallion with deliberate slowness, his pale blue eyes never leaving the group of men who had surrounded Sarah's cabin. The silence stretched between them like a taut wire, broken only by the soft stamping of horses and the distant sound of night insects. I said you're trespassing, Marcus repeated, his voice carrying the quiet authority of a man accustomed to being obeyed. This is private property, and the lady hasn't invited you here. Jake Morrison stepped forward, emboldened by the presence of his companions and the whiskey coursing through his veins. We don't take orders from strangers, mister. This is our town, and we're dealing with our problem. Marcus's smile was cold as winter steel. Your problem? That's right, Pete Hawkins chimed in, moving to flank Jake on his left side. Sarah Mae Thompson has been a blight on this community for 10 years. We're just encouraging her to find somewhere else to spread her poison. Marcus nodded thoughtfully, as if considering their words with genuine interest. I see. And what crime has Miss Thompson committed that warrants a visit from 6 armed men in the middle of the night? The question hung in the air, and, for a moment, none of the men seemed to know how to answer it. They had lived with their version of events for so long that they had forgotten how it might sound to someone hearing it for the first time. She attacked Billy Jameson, Danny Jameson finally said, his voice carrying less conviction than it had earlier. Nearly killed him. Ah yes, young Billy, Marcus replied. I had an interesting conversation with him this afternoon. The statement hit the group like a physical blow. Danny Jameson went pale, and several of the other men exchanged nervous glances. The idea that this stranger had actually spoken to Billy about what happened that night clearly terrified them. What did he tell you? Jake Morrison demanded, trying to maintain his aggressive posture despite the obvious shift in dynamics. Marcus reached into his coat pocket, and every man present tensed, hands moving toward their weapons. But what he pulled out was not a gun, it was a folded piece of paper. He told me the truth, Marcus said simply. All of it. Would you like me to share it with the rest of you? Inside her cabin, Sarah pressed her ear to the door, straining to hear every word of the conversation taking place outside. The revelation that Marcus had spoken to Billy Jameson sent a shock through her system. For 10 years, she had lived with the knowledge that Billy knew the truth about what had happened that night, but she had never expected him to admit it. You're lying, Danny Jameson said, but his voice cracked on the words. My brother would never change his story. Marcus unfolded the paper and held it up so that the moonlight illuminated the writing. This is a sworn statement, signed by Billy Jameson and witnessed by Dr. Hayes. In it, your brother admits that he was drunk on the night in question, that he attempted to force himself on Miss Thompson, and that his injury was the result of his own clumsiness when she defended herself. The silence that followed this revelation was deafening. Several of the men stared at Danny Jameson, waiting for him to deny the stranger's claims, but Danny seemed incapable of speech. Furthermore, Marcus continued, his voice growing harder, Billy admits that the story spread through town was a fabrication designed to protect his reputation and that of his family. He deeply regrets the harm that this lie has caused to Miss Thompson's life and standing in the community. Pete Hawkins found his voice first. That's impossible. Billy would never admit to something like that. Marcus smiled that cold smile again. Wouldn't he? Are you so sure of that, Pete? Because I had a very convincing conversation with young Billy this afternoon. It seems that 10 years of living with the guilt of what he did to an innocent woman has weighed heavily on his conscience. Jake Morrison stepped forward aggressively. I don't care what that paper says. We know what kind of woman Sarah Mae Thompson is, and we want her gone. What kind of woman is that, Jake? Marcus asked quietly. The kind that brings trouble wherever she goes. The kind that decent folks don't want living among them. Marcus studied Jake's face for a long moment, and, when he spoke again, his voice carried a note of genuine curiosity. Tell me, Jake, what has Miss Thompson actually done to you personally? Has she stolen from you? Harmed your family? Spread lies about you? Jake shifted uncomfortably. That's not the point. Actually, that's exactly the point, Marcus replied. You see, I've spent the last 10 hours in this town, talking to people, listening to stories, and what I've discovered is quite interesting. Miss Thompson pays her bills on time, keeps to herself, and has never caused trouble for anyone. The only complaints people have about her are based on a lie told by a drunken young man who was too cowardly to face the consequences of his actions. Now you listen here, Danny Jameson finally found his voice, stepping forward with his hand on his gun. I don't care what my brother might have said to you. I won't have you insulting my family. Marcus's expression didn't change, but something in his posture shifted, and, suddenly, every man present was acutely aware that they were facing someone far more dangerous than they had initially realized. Your brother insulted your family 10 years ago when he attacked an innocent woman, Marcus said quietly. Your family insulted itself when it chose to destroy that woman's reputation rather than face the truth. And you're insulting whatever honor your family might have left by standing here tonight, armed and threatening, trying to finish what your brother started." Danny's face flushed red with anger and humiliation. "You can't talk to me like that." "I can talk to you however I please," Marcus replied, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "Because unlike the rest of you, I'm not afraid of the truth." The tension in the air was becoming unbearable. Several of the men had their hands on their weapons, and Sarah could sense that violence was only moments away. She made a decision that surprised even herself. She opened her front door and stepped out onto her porch. "Stop," she said firmly, her voice carrying clearly across the yard. "Whatever is happening here, I won't have bloodshed on my property." All eyes turned to her, and, for a moment, nobody moved. In the moonlight, Sarah looked smaller than usual, but there was something in her bearing that commanded attention and respect. Marcus touched the brim of his hat respectfully. "Miss Thompson, I apologize for the disturbance." "You have nothing to apologize for, Mr. Steele," Sarah replied, her gaze sweeping across the group of armed men. "These gentlemen, however, have a great deal to answer for." Jake Morrison stepped forward, trying to regain control of the situation. "Sarah May, we came here to give you a chance to leave peacefully. This stranger has filled your head with lies, but we're willing to overlook that if you'll just pack up and go." Sarah looked at Jake with an expression of profound sadness. "Jake Morrison, I taught your youngest sister to read when she was struggling in school. I've never done anything to harm you or your family. What have I done to deserve this hatred?" The question seemed to hit Jake like a physical blow. For a moment, his aggressive posture wavered, and something that might have been shame flickered across his face. "It's not personal, Sarah May," he said weakly. "It's just the way things are." "The way things are," Sarah repeated softly. "For 10 years, I've lived with the way things are. I've endured your whispers, your stares, your contempt, all based on a lie that you were all too eager to believe because it was easier than facing an uncomfortable truth." She stepped down from her porch, and Marcus moved slightly to position himself between her and the armed men, but Sarah walked around him with quiet dignity. "Billy Jameson attacked me," she said clearly, her voice carrying across the night air. "He was drunk and angry, and, when I rejected his advances, he tried to force himself on me. When I defended myself, he fell and injured himself. That is the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth." "You can't prove that," Pete Hawkins said, but his voice lacked conviction. Sarah reached into her dress pocket and pulled out a small object that glinted in the moonlight. "Actually, I can. This is Billy's class ring. He lost it that night when we struggled. I've kept it all these years, knowing that someday someone might want proof of what really happened." The men stared at the ring in Sarah's palm, and several of them began to look distinctly uncomfortable. The ring was undeniable evidence that Billy had been at the scene, evidence that supported Sarah's version of events. 10 years, Sarah continued, her voice growing stronger. 10 years of living as an outcast because of your need to protect the reputation of a family that didn't deserve protection. 10 years of loneliness and isolation because none of you had the courage to question a lie that served your purposes. Marcus watched the confrontation unfold with professional interest, noting how Sarah's quiet dignity was having a more powerful effect on the men than any amount of threats or violence could have achieved. Several of them were now looking at the ground, unable to meet her eyes. "But, you know what the worst part is?" Sarah asked, addressing the group but looking directly at Danny Jameson. "The worst part is that I forgave Billy years ago. I understood that he was young and drunk and foolish. I understood that people make mistakes. What I've never been able to understand is how an entire community could choose cruelty over compassion, lies over truth, hatred over justice." Danny Jameson's hand fell away from his gun, and, for the first time since the confrontation began, he looked directly at Sarah. What he saw there wasn't the scarred, bitter woman he had expected, but someone whose pain and dignity made him deeply ashamed of his own actions. "Sarah," he said quietly, we. "You what, Danny?" Sarah asked gently. "You're sorry? You didn't know? You were just following the crowd?" Danny opened his mouth to speak, then closed it again, realizing that there was nothing he could say that would excuse 10 years of persecution. Marcus stepped forward, sensing that the moment for violence had passed but knowing that the situation was far from resolved. "Gentlemen, I think it's time for you to leave. Miss Thompson has made her position clear, and I believe she's answered any questions you might have had about her character." "And if we don't leave?" Jake Morrison asked, though his earlier bravado had evaporated. Marcus smiled that cold smile one last time. "Then, I'll have to insist. And, trust me when I tell you that you don't want me to insist." There was something in his voice that made it clear this wasn't an empty threat. Jake looked around at his companions, realizing that their night of intimidation had turned into something very different from what they had planned. "This isn't over," he said weakly, but everyone present knew that it was. One by one, the men began to mount their horses, their movements lacking the confidence they had shown when they arrived. Danny Jameson was the last to leave, pausing to look back at Sarah one more time. "For what it's worth," he said quietly, "I'm sorry." Sarah nodded acknowledgement but said nothing. Some apologies came too late to matter, and they both knew it. As the riders disappeared into the darkness, Sarah and Marcus stood together in the sudden silence, both of them aware that something fundamental had changed in Willow Creek that night. "That was very brave," Marcus said finally. Sarah shook her head. "It was necessary. I've been hiding from the truth for 10 years, letting their lies define who I am. Tonight, I finally told my story." Marcus looked at her with something approaching admiration. "And how does it feel?" Sarah considered the question seriously. "Liberating," she said finally. "Terrifying, but liberating." Marcus nodded. "The truth usually is." As they stood there under the Texas stars, both of them knew that the confrontation that night had been about more than just one woman's reputation. It had been about the power of lies to destroy lives, the courage required to stand up to mob mentality, and the possibility of redemption even in the darkest circumstances. Sarah Mae Thompson had finally told her truth, and, in doing so, she had taken the first step toward reclaiming her life. The pale-eyed stranger who had promised to change everything had kept his word, but the real change had come from within Sarah herself. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new decisions, and new possibilities. But tonight, for the first time in 10 years, Sarah Mae Thompson was truly free. 3 months had passed since the night Marcus Steele had faced down the mob at Sarah's cabin, and Willow Creek had become a very different place. The truth about Billy Jameson's attack had spread through the town like wildfire, forcing people to confront the cruelty of their own actions and the lies they had chosen to believe. Some, like Danny Jameson, had found the courage to seek Sarah's forgiveness. Others, like Jake Morrison and Pete Hawkins, had simply disappeared from town, unable to face the shame of their behavior. The Reverend had delivered a series of sermons about the sin of bearing false witness, though he never mentioned Sarah by name. But Sarah herself was no longer in Willow Creek to witness these changes. She had left with Marcus the morning after the confrontation, riding beside him on the road that led to California and a new life. Her cabin sat empty now, though Marcus had arranged for a caretaker to maintain the property. "Just in case you ever want to come back," he had said, though they both knew she never would. The journey to California had taken 6 weeks, and every mile had carried Sarah further from the woman she had been in Willow Creek. Marcus was a patient traveling companion, content to ride in comfortable silence for hours at a time, but always ready with conversation when she needed it. He told her stories of the places he had been, the people he had known, and the cattle operation he had built from nothing in the mountains of Northern California. "Your brother was right about you," he said one evening as they camped beside a stream in Nevada. "He said you were the strongest person he had ever known, and the kindest." Sarah looked up from the fire she was tending, studying Marcus's face in the flickering light. Over the weeks of their journey, she had learned to read the subtle expressions that crossed his features, the way his ice blue eyes softened when he spoke of people he cared about. "David always saw the best in people," she replied. "Sometimes I think it was a blessing that he left Willow Creek when he did. He never would have survived seeing what I became there." Marcus shook his head firmly. "You didn't become anything in Willow Creek except a victim of other people's cowardice. The woman you are now, the woman you've always been, that's what your brother saw, and it's what I see too." The words hung between them in the night air, carrying a weight of meaning that neither of them was quite ready to acknowledge. But Sarah felt something shift in her chest, a warmth that had nothing to do with the fire and everything to do with the man sitting across from her. When they finally reached the steel ranch in the mountains above Sacramento, Sarah understood immediately why Marcus took such pride in his operation. The main house was built of local stone and timber, constructed with the kind of craftsmanship that would last for generations. The barns and outbuildings were equally impressive, and everywhere she looked, she could see evidence of prosperity and good management. David was waiting for them on the front porch of the main house, and the reunion between brother and sister was everything Marcus had hoped it would be. David had grown taller and broader in the years since leaving Texas, and success had given him the confidence that had been lacking in his youth. But his face when he saw Sarah was still that of the little boy who had worshipped his big sister. "Sarah May," he said, enveloping her in a bear hug that lifted her feet off the ground. "God, how I've missed you." Sarah held onto her brother tightly, feeling tears stream down her face as she realized that this moment had been worth every hardship she had endured in Willow Creek. David was safe, successful, and happy, and seeing him again healed something in her soul that she hadn't even realized was broken. "You look good, little brother," she said when he finally set her down. "California agrees with you." David grinned, but his expression grew serious as he studied her face. "And you look tired, sister. But we're going to fix that." Marcus had given Sarah her own room in the main house, a spacious chamber with windows that looked out over the valley below. It was the most beautiful room she had ever slept in, with handmade furniture and quilts that reminded her of home without carrying the painful memories of Willow Creek. On her first morning at the ranch, Sarah woke to the sound of cattle lowing in the distance and the rich smell of coffee drifting up from the kitchen below. For a moment, she lay still in the comfortable bed, marveling at the simple pleasure of waking up in a place where she was welcome, where she belonged. The weeks that followed were a revelation. Marcus introduced her to the other people who worked and lived on the ranch, and, to Sarah's amazement, they welcomed her without question or judgment. These were people who knew nothing of her past, who saw only a woman who was clearly important to their boss and deserving of their respect. Elena Vasquez, the ranch's housekeeper and cook, became Sarah's first friend in her new life. She was a widow in her 50s whose husband had worked for Marcus before his death, and she had stayed on to help manage the household. Elena had a gift for reading people, and she saw immediately that Sarah was someone who had been hurt but was ready to heal. "Senor Marcus is a good man," she told Sarah one afternoon as they worked together in the kitchen garden. "But he is lonely, I think. He needs someone to share all this with." Sarah felt her cheeks warm at the implication. "Elena, you don't think what, Nija? That he cares for you? A blind woman could see the way he looks at you." It was true that Marcus had been nothing but kind and attentive since her arrival at the ranch. He made sure she had everything she needed, included her in all the ranch's social activities, and seemed genuinely interested in her opinions about everything from the running of the household to the management of the cattle operation. But Sarah had lived so long as an outcast that the idea of being genuinely wanted and valued seemed almost too good to believe. Surely a man like Marcus, successful and respected, could have his choice of women. Why would he be interested in someone with her history? The answer came on a warm evening in late spring, 6 months after her arrival in California. Sarah was sitting on the porch of the main house, working on a quilt by lamplight, when Marcus emerged from the house and settled into the chair beside her. "That's beautiful work," he said, studying the intricate pattern she had created. "Thank you," Sarah replied, continuing to stitch as they talked. "It's called Double Wedding Ring. I thought it might make a nice gift for David when he finds someone to marry." Marcus was quiet for a long moment, and, when Sarah looked up from her work, she found him watching her with an expression she couldn't quite read. "Sarah," he said finally, "there's something I need to tell you." Her hands stilled on the quilt, and she felt a familiar flutter of anxiety in her chest. In her experience, conversations that began with those words rarely ended well. "What is it?" she asked quietly. Marcus leaned forward in his chair, his pale blue eyes serious in the lamplight. "I didn't bring you to California just because your brother asked me to. Sarah set down her sewing completely, giving him her full attention. "What do you mean?" "I mean that from the moment I met you in that cabin in Texas, I knew you were extraordinary. Your dignity in the face of that town's cruelty, your strength in building a life despite their hatred, your kindness despite everything you had suffered, it was unlike anything I had ever encountered." Sarah stared at him, hardly daring to believe what she was hearing. "Marcus, let me finish," he said gently. "I've spent my entire adult life building this ranch, accumulating wealth and property and all the things I thought would make me happy. But, until I met you, I never understood what was missing." He reached over and took her hand in his touch warm and gentle. "You were missing, Sarah. You and your courage and your goodness and your beautiful heart. I brought you here because I was falling in love with you, and I hoped that maybe, given time, you might learn to love me too." Sarah felt tears prick at her eyes, but, for the first time in years, they were tears of joy rather than sorrow. "You love me," she whispered. "I do," Marcus replied firmly. "I love your strength and your kindness. I love the way you see beauty in simple things, the way you care for everyone around you. I love the sound of your voice and the way your eyes light up when you're happy. I love everything about you, Sarah Mae Thompson." Sarah thought of all the people who had told her she would die alone, all the voices that had convinced her she was unworthy of love. But, looking into Marcus's eyes, she saw nothing but truth and devotion. "I love you too," she said, the words coming out as barely more than a breath. "I think I started falling in love with you the moment you dismounted from that black horse and treated me with respect." Marcus smiled then, the cold expression she had first seen in Willow Creek replaced by warmth and tenderness. "Then, will you marry me, Sarah? Will you let me spend the rest of my life proving that those people in Texas were wrong about everything?" Sarah thought of the wedding ring quilt in her lap, of the irony of stitching a pattern she had never expected to use herself. She thought of Mrs. Henderson's prediction that she would die alone, of Jake Morrison's certainty that no decent man would ever want her. "Yes," she said, her voice growing stronger with each word. "Yes, I'll marry you, Marcus Steele. And I'll spend the rest of my life being grateful that you saw who I really was when no one else could." Marcus leaned forward and kissed her then, gently and reverently, as if she were something precious beyond measure. And, for the first time in her adult life, Sarah felt truly beautiful. Their wedding took place 6 weeks later in the church in Sacramento, with David giving Sarah away and the entire ranch community in attendance. Sarah wore a dress of ivory silk that Elena had helped her make, and Marcus wore a black suit that made his pale blue eyes seem even more striking. As they stood before the altar, exchanging vows that promised a lifetime of love and partnership, Sarah thought of the scarred woman who had lived in isolation in Willow Creek. That woman seemed like someone from another life now, someone she had been but was no longer. "With this ring," Marcus said, sliding a band of gold onto her finger, "Ivy wed. And I promise that your eternity of happiness begins with me." The words echoed the title the townspeople of Willow Creek had given to their story. They had sworn she would die lonely, but, instead, her eternity was beginning with the love of a good man who saw her true worth. After the ceremony, as they danced at their reception under the California stars, Sarah marveled at the turns her life had taken. She had traveled from despair to hope, from isolation to love, from a place where she was despised to a place where she was cherished. "No regrets?" Marcus asked as they swayed together to the music of the small orchestra he had hired for the occasion. Sarah looked around at the faces of their friends and family, all of them glowing with happiness for the newlyweds. She thought of the ranch that would be her home, the man who would be her husband, the future that stretched out before them filled with possibility. "None," she said firmly. "Not a single one." Years later, when Sarah Mae Steele was known throughout Northern California as one of the most respected and beloved women in the territory, people would sometimes ask her about her past, about the scars that marked her face and the sadness that occasionally flickered in her eyes. She would tell them, simply and without self-pity, about the young woman who had once lived in a place where lies were preferred to truth and cruelty was disguised as righteousness. She would speak of the importance of standing up for those who couldn't stand up for themselves, of the power of truth to overcome even the most deeply rooted prejudices. But, mostly, she would speak of the pale-eyed stranger who had ridden into her life like an answer to prayers she had never dared to pray. Marcus Steele had not just rescued her from Willow Creek, he had shown her that she was worth rescuing, that she deserved love and happiness and respect. They had 4 children together, 3 sons and a daughter, and Sarah raised them with the knowledge that every person deserved to be treated with dignity regardless of their past or their circumstances. The Steele children grew up understanding that their mother had overcome great hardships to build her life with their father, and they carried that lesson with them as they made their own ways in the world. Marcus kept his promise to make Sarah's eternity one of happiness. He loved her with the devotion of a man who understood how rare it was to find someone whose character had been tested by fire and proven to be pure gold. And Sarah loved him with the gratitude of a woman who had learned that sometimes salvation came in the form of a stranger with ice-blue eyes and an unshakable belief in justice. The people of Willow Creek had sworn she would die lonely, but they had been wrong about everything else, so perhaps it was fitting that they were wrong about that too. Sarah Mae Steele lived a long, happy life surrounded by love, and, when she finally passed away at the age of 87, she died in her husband's arms, with her children and grandchildren gathered around her bed. Her eternity had indeed begun with Marcus Steele, but it was an eternity filled with love, purpose, and the deep satisfaction that comes from a life well lived despite its difficult beginning. She had proven that the human spirit could triumph over prejudice and hatred, that truth could ultimately prevail over lies, and that sometimes, just sometimes, the stories people told about the lonely dying alone were nothing more than the bitter fantasies of those too small-minded to recognize true worth when they saw it. The pale-eyed cowboy's Growled promise had come true in ways even he might not have imagined when he first rode into Willow Creek on that long-ago October morning. Sarah's eternity had begun with him, but it had lasted a lifetime and, beyond, a testament to the transformative power of love offered to someone who had almost given up hope of ever receiving it.